The alkali dust of Willow Ridge chafed Levi Cutter's skin. It was a constant, gritty reminder of the land's indifference. He stood outside the telegraph office, the yellow paper flimsy in his hand, feeling the wind try to pull it from his grasp. It had been 3 months since the date Anna Schmidt was supposed to arrive. 3 months of silence, of riding back from the high pasture to find the cabin just as empty as he left it, save for his boy. He had nearly given up. The advertisement in the Eastern paper had felt like a fool's errand, a desperate move by a man worn thin. He wasn't looking for love. Love was buried 6 feet under. Along with his Elspeth, he was looking for a pair of hands, a woman to manage the cabin, to be a soft presence for his son. Thomas. He needed a partner in survival, even if the partnership was just ink on a contract. The message was blunt, stripped of courtesy by the telegraph wire. Bride arriving. 4 o'clock coach. Today. No name. No apology for the delay. Just that. He'd spent the last year since Elspeth's passing convincing himself he needed nothing. But the silence of the ranch, the way young Thomas had retreated into himself, the mending pile that grew into a mountain, it all spoke a different truth. He needed help. He checked his pocket watch. 3:30. The coach was always late. He walked from the telegraph office down the town's single dusty street. Willow Ridge was not a welcoming place. It was a stopover, a place of cracked lumber and false fronts, baking under a relentless Wyoming sun. He untied his horse, mounted, and rode the wagon out to the crossroads where the stage always stopped, leaving the town itself behind. He waited, the silence of the high prairie vast around him, the sun beating on the brim of his hat. He was a patient man. The land demanded it. But this waiting felt different. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing if he was about to be saved or pushed. At nearly 5, a plume of dust rose in the east. It was the only movement for miles. Levi watched it draw closer, resolving into the shape of the heavy Concord coach and its 6-horse team. The driver pulled the horses to a halt, the animals blowing and stamping, their coats dark with sweat. "Got one for you, Cutter," the driver yelled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He climbed down stiffly and opened the passenger door. A man in a drummer's suit got out first, coughing into a handkerchief. Then, she emerged. Levi felt a knot tighten in his gut. This was not Anna Schmidt. The woman in the advertisement had been 19, according to the letter he'd received months ago. A farmer's daughter from Ohio, described by her pastor as pious and sturdy. This woman was neither. She might have been 25, or she might have been 35. The harsh life etched on her face made it impossible to tell. Her dress was brown calico, washed so many times it was pale as dust, and patched neatly at the elbows. She was thin, but stood with a straightness in her spine that spoke of defiance, not weakness. And then there was her face. It was the first thing anyone would see. A long, puckered scar ran from the outside corner of her left eye, pulling the skin taut, up across her temple and vanishing into her hairline. It was an old wound, silvered and pale, but it marked her, defined her. She carried a single, battered valise, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. She stepped down onto the hard-baked earth and looked at him. Her eyes were not frightened. They were exhausted, wary, and assessing. "Mr. Cutter." Her voice was lower than he expected, with a slight rasp. "Ma'am." He kept his own voice flat. I am the bride you sent for." Levi's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked at the driver, who was already tossing her bag onto the ground. "I sent for a Miss Anna Schmidt." The woman's chin lifted. Just an inch. "Anna couldn't come. She fell ill. She sent me in her stead. My name is Clara Bell." It was a lie. A clumsy, desperate lie. Women were not sent instead like bags of mail. Levi knew it. He could see in the tightness of her jaw that she knew he knew it. He saw a dozen calculations flicker in her eyes. She was bracing for rejection, bracing to be left right here on the empty plain, 30 miles from the nearest town. He looked at the scar again. He thought of the empty cabin. He thought of the telegram, Bride arriving. It didn't say which bride. He was a man who believed in action, not words. The confrontation, the why, the who are you. It could all wait. Or maybe it didn't matter at all. She was here. He needed help. Without a word, Levi reached down, picked up her valise, and tossed it into the back of the wagon. He didn't offer her a hand up. He simply walked to the front and climbed onto the buckboard seat. Clara Bell watched him for a second, her expression unreadable. Then, with a visible steadying breath, she hiked her patched skirt, put a boot on the wheel spoke, and pulled herself up onto the seat beside him. The ride to the ranch was 8 miles. They passed them in near total silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the jingle of the harness, and the vast, sighing wind that never stopped. Levi kept his eyes on the horizon. He could feel her presence beside him, rigid, alert, like a trapped animal pretending to be calm. He glanced sideways. She wasn't looking at him. She was scanning the land, her eyes taking in the endless, rolling brown hills, the canyons shadowy in the late afternoon, the sheer, crushing emptiness of the territory. She didn't flinch from it. She just watched. He saw her hands, resting on her lap. They were not the soft hands of a farmer's daughter. They were chapped, with calluses on the palms and short, clean nails. Hands that had worked, and worked hard. "It's a hard land," he said, the first words spoken in an hour. She turned her head. "I ain't afraid of hard." He nodded. That, he believed. The ranch was nestled in a small valley, protected from the worst of the wind by a high bluff. The cabin was cottonwood, sturdy and plain. With a wide porch, a larger barn stood 100 yards away. It was clean, orderly, but weathered. As they pulled up, the cabin door opened and a small boy slipped out. He stood by the porch rail, watching them, his small face a mask of wary curiosity. He had Levi's dark hair and solemn eyes. "This is my son, Thomas," Levi said, climbing down. "Thomas, this is Miss Bell. She'll be staying with us." Clara looked at the boy. Her face, already stiff, seemed to tighten. She didn't smile or offer a greeting. She just looked at him, as if seeing a complication she hadn't prepared for. Thomas, in turn, stared openly at her scar. "Go on inside, Thomas," Levi said, pulling the valise from the wagon. The boy vanished back into the cabin. Clara followed Levi onto the porch, her boots loud on the wooden planks. The inside was dark and cool. It smelled of wood smoke, old coffee, and something Levi recognized as loneliness. It was a man's space, swept clean but lacking any softness. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A long table and 2 benches sat in the middle. "Your room is here," Levi said, gesturing to a small door off the main room. She entered. It was barely more than a closet, holding a narrow cot, a washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher, and a single wooden peg on the wall for her clothes. A small window looked out onto the endless prairie. "It's clean," she said. "The kitchen is there, water's from the well out back, privy's behind the woodshed. I'm usually up before 5. I'll expect coffee on. I earn my keep," she said, her voice flat. "We'll see." He left her then. He gave her the space she seemed to crave, the space he himself needed. He went to the barn to check the stock, to put his hands on the familiar, grounding work of his life. He left her to settle into the silence, to face the boy, and to confront the ghosts that had so obviously followed her west. Clara stood in the small room for a long time, just listening. She heard the boy moving in the main room, the soft scrape of a chair. She heard the wind whistling around the eaves. She was here. She was safe, for now. But safety was an illusion. It was the quiet just before the saloon door slammed open. She closed her eyes, and the memory hit her like a fist. It wasn't a clear picture, just a wash of terror. The smell of cheap, spilled whiskey. The roar of a man's voice, Mal's voice. The heavy, slamming sound of the saloon door, vibrating the floorboards. The flare of firelight reflecting on shattered glass. A scream. It might have been hers. Her hand trembled. She opened her valise. There was one change of clothes, a bar of soap, and a small leather pouch. From inside the pouch, she pulled a stocking. Unrolling it, she revealed a small skinning knife, its blade honed to a razor's edge. She looked at the cot. The pillow was thin, stuffed with straw. She lifted it, slid the knife beneath, and placed the pillow back down. Only then did she step out of the room. Thomas was at the table, pretending to read a worn primer, but his eyes were fixed on her. She nodded at him stiffly, then went to the stove. She found the coffee grinder, the sack of beans, and the pot. She found the flour and the salt pork. She began to cook, her movements economical and practiced. She would earn her keep. 2 days later, Levi rode into Willow Ridge. He needed flour and salt, but he also needed perspective. He found Sheriff Brody on the boardwalk, chair tilted back against the wall of his office, whittling a piece of pine. Brody was a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same hard-bitten landscape as the bluffs. "Levi," Brody grunted, not looking up. "Brody!" Levi leaned against the neighboring post. He felt foolish, like a man complaining about the weather. "That bride I sent for, she arrived. Heard the coach came in. Figured you'd be celebrating your good fortune." "It ain't the one I ordered," Levi said quietly. "Different woman, different name. She's marked, got a scar, looks hunted." Brody stopped whittling. He looked at Levi, his eyes sharp. "She lie about her name. Said the other one sent her in her stead. I reckon she's running." The sheriff sighed, closing his knife and slipping it into his pocket. He leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "Levi, you ordered a woman like she was a sack of flour. People ain't flour. They're trouble, mostly. This one, she running from a husband? A lawman? I don't know," Levi admitted. "She don't talk." "Well, a woman's got her reasons. Maybe she's run from worse than you." Brody spat into the dust. "Long as she ain't bringing that trouble here, maybe just let her be. She pulling her weight? She cooks, she cleans, hasn't complained. Well, then..." Brody stood, stretching his back. "Some of the hardest workers I ever knew were folks running from something awful. You just keep your eyes open. Trouble comes to my town. I'll handle it. But a woman with a scar trying to start over, that ain't trouble. That's just Tuesday." Levi nodded, feeling strangely settled. He bought his flour and rode home. The conversations in the cabin were terse. They were exchanges of necessity, not comfort. "There's mending," Levi said one evening, dropping a pile of Thomas's torn shirts on the table. "I saw 'em," Clara replied, not looking up from the stove. By morning, they were folded on his chair, the stitches small, tight, and stronger than the original fabric. "I'm riding up to the north pasture, checking the herd. I'll be back by dark. Thomas can't be left," he said a few days later. "I can ride," she said, her back to him. Levi paused. "I ain't got a side saddle." "Don't need one." He took her to the barn. He gestured to the spare mare, a nervous paint named Flicker. "She's mean." Clara just looked at the horse. The mare flattened her ears and shuffled. Clara didn't try to soothe it. She approached it with a low, steady murmur, her body calm but firm. She bridled it with an efficient movement that surprised him. When it came time to saddle, she didn't flinch when the horse tried to nip her. She just pushed its head away, finished the cinch, and gathered the reins. She mounted not like a lady, but like a hired hand, swinging her leg over the saddle, her patched skirt hiking up to show worn men's boots. She rode beside him all day, her back straight, her seat easy. She didn't talk. She just watched the cattle, her eyes sharp. The real test came the following week. It was time for the late spring branding, Levi's only hired hand. A quiet young man named Silas came over to help. The day was hot, the air thick with the smell of dust and burnt hair, the bawling of calves echoing off the bluff. Levi and Silas were working the ropes, Levi's horse cutting the calves, Silas flanking them. Clara was supposed to be keeping the fire hot and the irons ready. Silas missed a throw. The calf bolted. Before Levi could even turn his horse, a rope sang out. It snapped tight around the calf's hind legs, clean and perfect. Levi looked stunned. Clara was standing by the fire, the end of her rope tied off to a fence post. She had thrown it from 30 feet away. You can rope," Silas said, his mouth open. "I'll flank," she said, walking over. She pulled the rope tight, dug in her heels, and flipped the calf onto its side with a wrestler's efficiency. She held it down with a knee on its neck, calm as could be, while Silas gaped. "Iron's hot," she said to Levi. Levi dismounted, grabbed the iron, and branded the calf. He looked at Clara, who was already loosening the rope, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. She was not the woman from the advertisement. She was something else entirely. That evening, the three of them sat on the porch, exhausted and quiet. Thomas, who had been watching the branding from a safe distance, came and sat near Clara. He had been orbiting her for days, like a wary colt. She, in turn, never fussed over him. She treated him like a small man, not a child. He sat on the step below her, tracing patterns in the dust. He had been staring at her scar all day. "Did it hurt?" he asked, his voice small. Clara stopped mending a bridle. Levi, sitting in the shadows, went still. She looked at the boy. Her expression didn't change. "It did," she said. "Who did it?" Clara looked out at the prairie, now turning purple in the twilight. "Sometimes, Thomas," she said, her voice low and even. "Folks hurt people when they think they own 'em, when they think a person is a thing instead of a who." Thomas thought about this. "My PA don't own you." "No," she said. "He don't." She went back to her sewing. Levi watched from the darkness. He had overheard the entire exchange. He had spent the last week watching her. She was the first one up, the coffee boiling before the sun had even breached the horizon. She was the last one to bed, mending his clothes or oiling his tack by the weak light of the lantern. She never complained, not about the food, which was monotonous, not about the hard work, not about the wind that drove grit into every corner of the cabin. He remembered Elspeth. Elspeth had been soft and sweet, and she had hated this land. She had tried, but the prairie had broken her spirit long before the fever took her body. This woman, Clara, was different. The land didn't scare her. She seemed carved from it. She was as hard and unforgiving as the landscape itself. He realized, sitting there, that he hadn't truly looked at her face since she arrived. He had only seen the scar, but now, watching her gentle, honest answer to his son, he saw the person behind it. He saw the sharp line of her jaw, the steadiness of her hands, the absolute stillness with which she shouldered her pain. She was a liar, yes, but she was also the strongest person he had ever met. Later that night, the house was silent. A full moon washed the prairie in silver, bright as day. Levi couldn't sleep. The image of Clara flanking the calf and the quiet way she spoke to Thomas turned over and over in his mind. He stood and pulled on his boots, stepping out onto the porch for a pipe. The air was cool and clean. He heard a sound, almost too quiet to catch, a choked sob. He walked around the side of the cabin, toward the water trough. She was there, hidden in the deep shadow of the overhang, her back to him. She thought she was alone. Her shoulders were shaking in a desperate, silent weeping. He didn't mean to startle her. He just stopped, the sound of his boots scraping gravel. Clara froze. She scrubbed her face with her hands, her whole body tensing like a bowstring. She turned, angry. "I'm just tired," she snapped, her voice thick. "Don't you pity me?" Levi stood there, the moonlight illuminating her face, catching the wet tracks on her cheeks. He looked at the scar, and for the first time, it just seemed like a part of her, like the color of her eyes. "I don't pity you," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the night. The fight went out of her, replaced by a wave of crushing shame. The truth, the one she had been holding back, finally burst out. "I ain't what you ordered, Mr. Cutter." Her voice was a low tremble. "I know it. You ordered pretty. You ordered young. You ordered Anna Schmidt, with her pious ways and her farm girl hands. And you got me." She gestured to her face. to her patched dress. "I'm a liar. I stole her name. I stole her ticket. I had to get away." She waited for the verdict, for the anger, for him to tell her to pack her valise and be gone by morning. Levi looked at her, standing in the cold moonlight. He thought of the empty chair at his table. He thought of the year of silence his son had endured. He thought of her hands on the rope, her calm answer to Thomas, and the small, sharp knife he knew was hidden under her pillow. He took a slow breath, the prairie wind cold in his lungs. "No," he said, his voice flat and final. "You ain't what I ordered." He saw her flinch, bracing for the final blow. He let the silence stretch, just for a beat. "But you showed up. That's more than most." He turned, his boots echoing on the hard-packed earth, and walked back into the cabin, leaving her alone in the silver light. The confession hung in the air, a fragile bridge between them, and then it was gone. Levi's words. "You showed up," were not forgiveness. They were a statement of fact. They were, perhaps, enough. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the cattle. Clara's days began at 4 a.m, the cabin dark and cold. She moved with a practiced economy, grinding the coffee, stoking the fire, her hands quick and sure in the pre-dawn chill. She learned the ranch's needs as if she had always known them. She learned to bank the fire to last, to make sourdough starter from nothing but flour and air, to calculate their dwindling supplies of salt and sugar with a miser's precision. The last of the winter snows melted, turning the valley into a muddy quagmire, and calving season began. It was a brutal, sleepless time. The weather turned, dumping a late, wet snow on them. Clara worked alongside Levi, pulling her weight and more. She was tireless, her thin frame belying a deep well of stamina. One night, a storm raging outside. Levi stumbled into the cabin, soaked and shaking, his face grim. "Heifer's in trouble," he said, grabbing a rope. "Calf's breached." Clara was already pulling on her boots and the oilskin coat Levi had left for her. "I'm coming. It's bloody work. Clara, I've seen blood." The barn was loud with the wind and the pained bawling of the young cow. Levi worked for an hour, his arm deep inside the heifer, his face slick with sweat, trying to turn the calf. It was no use. He finally staggered back, leaning against the stall, defeated. "It's lost. She's too small." Clara looked at the animal, its eyes wide with pain. She looked at Levi's large, muscled forearm. She walked over, shedding the coat. "Your hands are too big," she said. She dipped her own hands in the bucket of warm water, rubbing them with tallow. "Hold her head." Levi looked at her, about to argue, but the authority in her voice stopped him. He went to the heifer's head, stroking its face, murmuring. Clara knelt in the straw. She was smaller, and her hands, though calloused, were slender. She breathed slowly, her face set in concentration, and went to work. She did not panic. She did not flinch from the heat and the blood. She worked with a focused, gentle patience, her lips drawn into a thin line. Levi watched, astonished, as she found what he could not, a hoof, a leg. She tied the small rope, and together, with the heifer's final, exhausted push, they pulled. The calf, slick and still, slid onto the straw. It was small, but it was whole. Clara rubbed it vigorously with a dry sack. Clearing its mouth, it sputtered, coughed, and let out a thin, reedy wail. Levi sank against the wall, the tension draining from him. He just watched her. She was covered in filth, her hair falling from its bun, the scar on her face stark in the lantern light. She looked like a warrior. Her bond with Thomas deepened in the small, quiet moments. He had stopped staring at her scar and started watching her hands. He would sit at the table while she kneaded bread, or follow her as she fed the chickens. He was a solemn child, carrying a grief he didn't understand. One afternoon, they sat on the porch steps together, shelling peas. The sun was warm, the first real warmth of spring. He still keeps her shawl in his trunk, Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. Clara didn't stop her work. Your mother's? Yes, ma'am. He fumbled with a pod. He doesn't talk about her, not ever, but I know he misses her. I think he's afraid to be happy. He thinks he's not allowed. Clara paused, her hands still. She thought of the emptiness she had seen in Levi's eyes. She knew what it was to be haunted. Grief's a heavy stone, Thomas, she said quietly, looking out at the high bluffs. You don't ever really put it down. You just learn to carry it. Thomas nodded. Digesting this. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad to be here. Thomas. Levi's quiet kindness was a different kind of trial. It was an unfamiliar language. He never complimented her. He never said, thank you. But one morning, after a long day of mending fences where the barbed wire had torn her hands raw, she woke to find a small bundle on the table. Inside were gloves. They were not new. Store-bought gloves. They were made of supple, tanned deer hide, and the stitches along the seams were thick and slightly uneven. They were men's gloves, but they had been re-sewn, made smaller. He had made them for her. She pulled them on. They fit perfectly. Her hands, chapped and cracked, were instantly warmed. She closed her eyes, a sharp, painful ache blooming in her chest. A man's kindness, in her experience, was a down payment. It was a debt to be collected later, usually in a dark room, but Levi just nodded when he saw her wearing them, his face giving nothing away. Didn't have much, he said, turning to the stove. But they're warm. That night, the guilt ate at her. This man, this good, quiet, broken man, had given her shelter. He had given his son into her care, and he had protected her hands. She was living a lie that was darkening his doorway. After Levi and Thomas were deep asleep, Clara lit a single candle. She pulled her valise from under the cot and took out a precious, folded sheet of paper and a small vial of ink. She sat on her cot, the knife a hard lump under her pillow, and began to write. To Miss Anna Schmidt, whereabouts unknown. I write this knowing you will never see it. I must write it all the same. I am a thief. I stole your name. I stole your ticket from the agent in Cheyenne. You were late, and I was desperate. I took your chance at a new life. She wrote of the saloon, though she did not name it. She wrote of the fear, of the need to escape. I did not know about the boy. I did not know Mr. Cutter was a good man. I am living in a house that is not mine, under a name I have no right to. I am sorry. I hope you found peace. She stared at the letter, the ink drying. It was a confession to no one. She folded it, her hands trembling, and found a loose board in the floor beneath her cot. She slipped the letter into the dark, dusty space, hiding it away. It felt wrong, but letting it see the light of day felt worse. The trigger for the past was simple. Levi had been to Willow Ridge and returned with a heavy sack of flour and, for himself, a bottle of cheap whiskey. He poured a small amount into his coffee that night. The sharp, sweet, sour smell of it cut through the aroma of wood smoke and bacon fat. Clara, washing the tin plates, froze. The smell, it was the smell of the Crimson Garter. The smell of stale beer, unwashed men, and the cloying perfume Mal Granger insisted his girls wear. She was standing not in Levi's cabin, but on the sawdust-covered floor, the tinny piano plinking a tune she would never forget. She saw him. Mal? A big man, with a laugh that sounded like a breaking log. He owned the place. He owned the girls. He had his hand clamped around her wrist, his thick fingers digging into her bones. You think you're too good for this? His voice, a gravelly roar in her ear, so loud she could feel it in her teeth. You think that scar makes you special? It just makes you cheap, but I own this pretty smile. What's left of it? And I'll sell it to the highest bidder. You hear me? You'll work off what you owe me. Clara Bell, one way or another. She remembered the surge of terror, not of him, but of the men he was selling her to. She remembered her hand, desperate, closing around the neck of an empty whiskey bottle on the bar. She hadn't meant to scar herself. She had smashed the bottle against the bar rail. intending to use the jagged edge on him. But he was too fast. He had backhanded her, hard. The force of the blow had driven the broken glass in her own hand into her face. It was the chaos of the moment. The blood, her own scream, the shock on his face, that had given her the chance. She had run. She had run out the back door, bleeding and terrified, and had not stopped running for 300 miles. The clatter of a tin plate slipping from her hand and hitting the floor broke the memory. She gasped, her breath coming short. She was in the cabin. She was safe. Levi was staring at her, his cup halfway to his mouth. "Clara?" She shook her head, unable to speak, and fled the cabin, gulping in the cold night air, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. Levi found her by the corral, her arms wrapped around herself. He saw the terror in her eyes. He had seen that look before, in horses trapped in a fire. He didn't ask what was wrong. He knew it was a place he couldn't follow. The next morning, he was quiet, but his eyes were watchful. The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken words. After breakfast, he stood, pulling on his hat. "The work can wait," he said, his voice firm. "The perch are biting at the lake. Thomas, get the poles." Thomas, sensing the shift, scrambled to obey. "I have mending," Clara protested, her voice still rough. "The mending can wait, too." The lake was 5 miles north, a small basin of alkali water that shimmered blue under the vast sky. It was the only break in the endless brown and gray of the prairie. They sat on the bank, the silence broken only by the lapping water and the cry of a hawk. Thomas, clumsy with excitement, kept tangling his line. Levi patiently undid the knots, his large hands gentle. Clara just sat, watching the water, letting the sun warm her face. It was the first time in her life she had ever been still. "Here," she found herself saying, after Thomas had snagged his hook in a sagebrush for the 3rd time. "Let me show you." She took the simple willow pole. "It's in the wrist, not your arm. Just flick it." She demonstrated, her own cast imperfect, but it cleared the weeds. On an impulse, she tried again, the small movement feeling almost natural. The line sailed out and landed softly. Almost instantly, the line went taut. She yelped, a small, involuntary sound of surprise, and hauled back. A small, silver-sided perch flapped on the end of the line. Thomas whooped, "You got one! You got one!" Clara, stunned, pulled it in. It was a scrawny, tiny thing, but it was a victory. She looked at it, then at Thomas's beaming face, and a strange, rusty sound bubbled up from her chest. She was laughing. It was a short, sharp bark, but it was a laugh. She looked at Levi. He was watching her, and the edges of his mouth had softened. A small, unused smile was pulling at his lips. Seeing him smile, seeing the genuine, unburdened joy in Thomas's face, made her laugh again, this time with a little more sound. And Levi Cutter, for the first time in what looked like a year, chuckled. The 3 of them, a scarred woman, a grieving man, and a lonely boy, stood by the lake and laughed. That night, the mood in the cabin was changed. The tight, brittle silence was gone, replaced by a softer quiet. Thomas was asleep, his face peaceful. Levi took the whiskey bottle from the cupboard. He set out 2 tin cups, not just his own. He poured 2 fingers in each and slid one across the table to her. "You earned this," he said, "after that calf you pulled. And the perch." She looked at the cup. She thought of the crimson garter. But this was different. This wasn't a transaction. It was a sharing. She picked it up. The whiskey was harsh, but it burned a warm path down. They sat in silence for a moment. "Thomas is right," Levi said, staring into his cup. "I do miss her. I miss not being alone. But it's more than that. I feel empty, like the best part of me was buried with her. I walk this ranch, I mend the fences, I brand the calves, and I don't feel a thing. I'm just hollow." The rawness of his confession loosened something in her. She looked down at her own hands, clutching the cup. "You're empty," she said, her voice low. "I'm spoiled, I ain't pure. Levi ain't whole. I know what you wanted. You wanted sweet and soft. Someone to fix what's broken. She touched her scar. I'm all wrong. I'm all sharp edges and bad memories. He was watching her, the firelight playing on his face. He saw the good side, and he saw the scar. He saw her. He leaned in slowly. It was not a lunge. It was not a demand. It was a question, asked without words. He was going to kiss her. She didn't mean to. It was an instinct, buried deeper than thought, the shadow of Mal, of a dozen other men with grabbing hands and hot whiskey breath, rose up. She didn't lean away. She flinched. It was a violent, sharp recoil. Her head snapped back, her hand coming up halfway as if to ward off a blow, her eyes wide with a sudden, animal panic. Levi stopped instantly. He didn't look angry. He didn't look rejected. He just stopped. He leaned back, his own face closing, and gave her all the space he had just tried to close. The cabin was utterly silent. He picked up his tin cup. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rough. I don't want to take anything. Clara, not ever. He met her eyes. I only give what you'll take. He stood, rinsed his cup, and went to his room, leaving her alone at the table. Trembling. Days passed. The moment was not spoken of. Levi was polite, distant, but something had shifted. He was more protective. They rode into Willow Ridge for supplies, the three of them on the wagon. Clara had saved up a few coins from selling eggs and wanted to buy Thomas a peppermint stick. She was standing by the candy jar in the mercantile while Levi loaded sacks of grain. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, leaned toward Levi, his voice a greasy, confidential whisper that carried in the small store. Must be desperate. Cutter to take on. Damaged goods. I hear the saloons in Cheyenne are full of them for half the price. Clara froze. She had heard whispers before, but this was blunt. She turned, her face pale, expecting Levi to ignore it, to brush it off. Levi didn't move. He set down the 50-pound sack of flour he was holding, very gently. He turned his head and looked at Henderson. His voice was not loud. It was flat and cold as a stone. The flour, he said. And add that bolt of blue calico she was looking at, and you'll weigh the salt again. My wife is particular about the weight. Henderson's smirk vanished. The word wife hung in the air like a gunshot. Now, Levi, I didn't mean weigh it. Henderson fumbled with the scales, his hands shaking. Levi paid, his movements economical, and then carried the sacks out. He didn't let Clara hear the words, but he had defended her. Not her, he had defended his wife. The ride home was silent. Clara was seething. The shame was one thing, the pity was worse. She waited until Thomas was in bed. She followed Levi to the barn as he unsaddled his horse. What did he say? She demanded. Levi kept his back to her, brushing the mare. It don't matter. Don't you protect me out of pity? She snapped, her voice trembling with a fury that surprised her. I ain't a lame horse you feel sorry for. I ain't your charity case. I saw your face. You think I need you to fight my battles? I've been fighting my own battles my whole life. He stopped brushing. He turned, and in the dim lantern light, his eyes were dark. It wasn't pity. It was something else, something she couldn't name. It's not pity, he said, his voice low and intense. He gestured to her. I've seen you take a branding iron like it's a paper cut. I saw you pull that calf when I was ready to give it up for lost. I saw you face down my boy's grief and give him a straight answer. He took a step closer. You're tougher than I ever was. Clara, tougher than I'll ever be. That ain't pity. His words hit her harder than a slap. No one had ever called her toughness a virtue. It was her flaw, her lack of softness, the thing that made her unlovable. He saw it as strength. She stood there in the barn, the smell of hay and horse all around her, and felt something crack open inside her. Maybe she wasn't damaged goods. Maybe she wasn't just sharp edges. Maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of something good. That night, the cabin was warm and quiet. Levi was reading a stockman's journal. Thomas was asleep. The peace felt real. Clara went to her room. She knelt, lifted the loose floorboard, and pulled out the folded letter to Anna Schmidt. She looked at the words she had written. I am a thief. She walked to the stove. The fire was low, just glowing embers. She opened the small iron grate. For a moment, she held the paper, the last tie to the woman she had been. Then she pushed it in. She watched the edges brown, curl and blacken. The paper flared, a bright, brief orange, and her confession, her guilt, and the name Anna Schmidt turned to gray ash. She was burying the lie, not by confessing it, but by burying it deeper. She was choosing this life. The lie was now part of the foundation, and she would build on it. The brief joy of the lake faded as spring announced itself not with gentle rain, but with a high, keening wind that blew for 22 straight days. It came from the north, a dry, cold blast that stole the last of the ground's moisture and shrieked around the corners of the cabin. They had worked from sunup until the light failed, planting Levi's small crop of corn and beans. Thomas, bundled in a coat, walked the rows, dropping seeds. Levi and Clara followed, covering them. It was hopeful work. For a week. Then the wind came and stripped the topsoil, leaving the seeds exposed, picked clean by crows. What few seedlings emerged were pale, thin, and then cut to ribbons by the airborne grit. The crop failed. The wind was a physical weight, pressing on them, fraying their nerves. The cabin felt small, the air thick with their shared anxiety. The work only doubled. With no crop, the cattle were everything. They rode the perimeter daily, mending fences, their bodies leaning into the relentless gale. Clara proved herself indispensable. She was not just a pair of hands, she was a bulwark. When the wind tore a section of the sod roof from the barn, she was on the ladder beside Levi, her skirts tied up, hauling the heavy, muddy blocks back into place, her face grimed with dirt, her scar a pale line in the muck. She took over the supply management. She was a general rationing a starving army. She cut their flour rations by a third, supplementing their meals with tough rabbits she snared in the scrub and woody spring greens she boiled for hours. She was frugal, tireless, and she never, ever complained. Levi would watch her, his own quiet nature finding a match in her fierce, silent endurance. They were partners in labor, bound by the shared fight against the land. But the ranch could not provide everything. Their salt was gone, the coffee was down to roasted barley, and Thomas needed new boots. A trip to Willow Ridge was unavoidable. Levi drove the wagon, Clara beside him, Thomas in the back. The wind had finally died, leaving a stunned, scoured silence. Clara felt the tension in her shoulders as they approached the town. She had not been back since Levi had called her his wife to Mr. Henderson. The mercantile was quiet. Mrs. Brody, the sheriff's wife, and Mrs. Henderson were at the counter, their heads bent over a bolt of cloth. They looked up when the bell on the door jingled, their eyes sliding over Levi and landing on Clara. Their conversation stopped. Clara felt the temperature drop. She walked to the counter, her list in her hand, her back straight. "Good morning, ladies," she said, her voice steady. "Mrs." Brody gave a short, tight nod. "Mrs." Henderson simply stared at Clara's face. Clara ignored them, turning to Mr. Henderson. "We need 20 pounds of salt, 5 of coffee, and a pair of boots. Size." She was interrupted by a whisper, sharp and clear in the small store, from Mrs. Henderson to Mrs. Brody. "That's her, the one I told you about." "Sakes alive." "Mrs." Brody whispered back, though she barely tried to lower her voice. "She's no mail-order bride. That face, that's saloon work, if I ever saw it. My husband said Levi called her wife right here in the store. Can you imagine what he must have been desperate for? She's probably a runaway whore, plain and simple." The word hit Clara like a physical blow. Whore. It was the word Mal had used. It was the word that had followed her out of Cheyenne. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin cold. She had expected stares. She had not expected this. This was the voice of the world she had fled, finding her here. She looked down at the counter. The spool of white thread she had been holding slipped from her fingers and rolled onto the floor. She didn't pick it up. She couldn't breathe. She turned, her movement stiff, and walked out of the store, leaving Levi, Thomas, and her list behind. She climbed onto the wagon seat and stared straight ahead. Her hands clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. Levi came out moments later, his face thunderous. He carried the sacks, threw them in the back, and climbed up beside her. He didn't speak. He grabbed the reins and the wagon lurched forward. The ride home was 8 miles of brutal, vibrating silence. She went straight to her room. She pulled her valise from under the cot. She was shaking, not with fear, with a cold, bottomless rage and a deeper, aching shame. They were right. She was damaged. She was a lie. And she was bringing that lie, that dirt, onto this man and his son. She folded her spare dress. She picked up the small knife from under her pillow. "Clara?" Levi was standing in the doorway, blocking the light. He saw the open valise. He saw the knife in her hand. "They're right," she said, her voice a low, rough rasp. "I'm what they said. I'm bringing shame on you. I won't let your son hear those words again. I'm leaving." "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "It don't matter. West, east. It's not your concern." "The hell it ain't." He took a step into the room. "You think running solves it? You think what those 2 old hens whisper matters more than the work we've done? More than that roof you held together?" "You don't understand," she choked out. I'm not good. I'm poisoning this place. I'm poisoning your boy." He was in front of her now. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a wall. "You don't get to quit," he said, his voice low and fierce. "You don't get to quit because people are small. You don't get to quit because people can't see past your skin." He waited, his eyes locked on hers. "You matter here, Clara. To Thomas. To me. You matter." She stared at him, the knife still clutched in her hand. He wasn't disgusted. He wasn't angry at her for causing a scene. He was angry for her. He had seen the ugliest part of her past named, and he hadn't flinched. The words, "You matter here," echoed in the small room, drowning out the whispers from the store. She slowly, very slowly, uncurled her fingers and let the knife fall onto the cot. He did not leave. The air between them was so thick she could barely draw a breath. The confrontation in the store, her packing, his words, it had broken something open. The tension that had been simmering for weeks, ever since her flinch, had now come to a head. He looked at her trembling hands, at her face, pale and defiant. He lifted his hand, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. He didn't touch her scar. He just cupped her jaw, his thumb resting lightly on her cheekbone. She didn't flinch. She didn't breathe. She just watched him. He leaned in. It was slow, uncertain. A question. She met him, her eyes closing, a small, broken sound in her throat. His lips were chapped, dry, hesitant. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been starving for something they didn't know how to name. It was raw and deep, and it tasted of salt and dust and shared loneliness. When he pulled back, neither of them spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. He simply nodded, his eyes dark, and left her room. The tension in the cabin thickened. They worked side by side, their arms brushing, their hands grazing as they passed tools. Every accidental touch was a spark. They avoided looking at each other, and in doing so, they saw nothing but each other. A week later, the sky, which had refused them rain, opened up. A massive thunderstorm rolled in from the west, a bruised, purple wall of cloud. The first crack of thunder shook the cabin, vibrating the tin cups on the shelf. They ate supper in silence, the storm raging around them. Rain hammered the roof in solid sheets. Levi watched the windows, worrying about a washout in the south pasture. Clara cleaned, her movements sharp. A bolt of lightning struck nearby, a blinding white-blue flash that lit the cabin, followed instantly by a deafening crash that sounded like the sky tearing in two. A moment later, a terrified wail came from Thomas's room. The door flew open, and the boy ran out, his face pale with terror. He didn't run to Levi. He ran straight to Clara. He slammed into her, wrapping his arms around her waist, burying his face in her skirts, his small body shaking. It's too loud. Clara froze, her hands still wet from the dishwater. She looked down at the top of his head, awkwardly. She put a hand on his hair. It's just noise. Thomas, it'll pass. Another crash, even louder, made him sob. He wouldn't let go. She looked at Levi, helpless. Levi just watched, his face unreadable. Clara sighed, her body softening. She untangled his arms, knelt, and guided him. Come on. She led him not to his bed, but to her own narrow cot. She pulled back the blanket. Get in. He scrambled under the covers. She sat on the edge, her back to the room. It's all right, she murmured, her voice lower than Levi had ever heard it. It's just the world making a fuss. Levi stood in the doorway of her small room, watching. He saw her, silhouetted by the lantern, her hand resting on his son's back, her quiet murmurs easing the boy's fear. He saw a mother. He saw a wife. He saw a woman who had faced down gossip, brutal work, and now his son's terror, all with the same unyielding strength. He felt an ache in his chest, a profound, hollow longing that was so sharp it almost bent him double. He quietly closed the door, leaving them to the storm, and went to bed alone. Days passed. The storm had broken the drought, but not the tension, the unspoken kiss, the night in her room. It all lay between them. They were back to working in the south pasture, mending the fence where the washout had taken it. It was dusk when they finished. They were both filthy, streaked with mud and sweat. The air was cool and damp. They walked the horses back to the barn, the silence comfortable, weary. Inside the barn, the air was warm, smelling of hay and animals. Clara slid off her horse, her knees almost buckling from exhaustion. She leaned against the stall, just for a second, closing her eyes. Levi was unsaddling his horse. He stopped, watching her. He walked over, standing in front of her. She looked up, her eyes tired. You're tired, he said. It was a simple fact. We all are. He didn't move. He just looked at her, his gaze tracing the lines of her face. He saw the grime on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes, and he saw the scar. He lifted his hand, the one that had held her jaw, and touched her face. But this time, his finger traced the scar itself. He moved from her temple, down the pulled skin, to the corner of her eye. She trembled, her breath hitching, but she held his gaze. She was so used to people looking at it, or looking away. No one had ever just touched it. I see you, Clara, he said, his voice rough. It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of fact. It meant more. He saw all of it. The mark, the woman, the lie, the strength. And he was still there. That broke her. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his chest, her hands clutching his dusty shirt. Levi, she whispered, her voice breaking. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. He kissed her hair, her temple. He led her, wordlessly, up the ladder to the hayloft, where the last light of day came through the high window, dust motes dancing in the beam. It was urgent, driven by weeks of unspoken, unrecognized need. It was gentle, a reverence in his touch that stunned her. He laid her back in the clean, sweet-smelling hay. He touched her body as if it were something holy, not something spoiled. And Clara, who had known only the bruising, demanding hands of men who sought to own her, trembled. She let herself be touched. She let herself be seen. She let herself go. Afterward, they lay in the hay, the barn dark below them, the first stars appearing in the loft window. She was curled against his side, his arm heavy and warm across her. The peace was terrifying. She felt the immediate, cold rush of guilt. You'll hate me, she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. You'll hate me when you know who I am, what I've done. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. His face was serious in the dim light. "Then tell me," he said. "I want to know all of you." She opened her mouth. The confession was there, on her tongue. The Crimson Garter, Mal, Anna Schmidt. But she couldn't. Not now, not after this. It felt like setting fire to the first safe place she had ever known. The next morning, Levi told her he was riding the North Range, checking for strays. He'd be gone all day. The confession would have to wait. The silence in the cabin, now that he was gone, was worse. She needed to tell him. She had to. She decided to ride into Willow Ridge. She needed yeast. It was an excuse. She needed to be moving. She needed to see the place that had condemned her. But this time, carrying the secret of Levi's acceptance, she tied her horse outside the mercantile. She felt stronger. She held her head high. She walked in, bought her yeast from Mr. Henderson, and nodded curtly at Mrs. Brody, who was there again. She walked out, and then she saw it. It was nailed to the post, right next to the sheriff's office. A new poster, printed on cheap paper, the ink still dark. Wanted, for information. $100 reward. There was a name, Clara Bell, and below it, runaway from the Crimson Garter Saloon. Cheyenne. Property of Mal Granger. Approach with caution. She is dangerous and manipulative. Notify M. Granger at the Willow Ridge Hotel. Her blood turned to ice. He was here. He wasn't in Cheyenne. He was here, in Willow Ridge, in the hotel, 50 feet from where she stood. She didn't panic. She moved. She untied her horse, her movements wooden, and mounted. She rode out of town, not running the horse, forcing herself to be calm until she was clear of the last building. Then she dug in her heels and flew. She burst into the cabin, her breath tearing at her lungs. "Thomas!" He wasn't there. She ran to her room, pulled the valise out. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unbuckle the straps. She threw her spare dress in. She grabbed the knife. She had to go. She had to lead him away from here. She couldn't let him find Levi and Thomas. "Clara, what are you doing?" Thomas was standing in the doorway, his face pinched with confusion. He had seen her ride in. He saw the valise. He saw the panic. I have to go. Thomas, go where?" His voice was small. "Are you leaving because of what those women said?" "No, Thomas, there's a bad man, a man from before. He's here. I have to go." His face crumpled. He understood. "Bad man." He ran to her and grabbed her skirt, his small hands bunching the fabric. "Don't go," he cried, his voice breaking. "Don't leave me! I need you!" She looked at his face, streaked with tears, and her resolve shattered. Running meant saving herself. Staying meant protecting him, but leaving meant abandoning him. She was torn, frozen by the impossible choice. "Clara!" Levi's voice. He was back. He must have seen her horse, lathered and heaving. He filled the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene, the valise, her white, terrified face, his son, weeping, clinging to her skirt. "What is this?" he demanded. She couldn't speak. She just pointed, her hands shaking. The poster, in town. He's here. His name is Mal Granger." She fled. She couldn't be in the cabin. She ran past him, out the door, toward the small stand of cottonwoods by the creek. She collapsed by the water, her body finally giving in to the terror. She heard him follow. He stopped a few feet behind her. "Tell me," he said. It was not a request. It was a command, and so she did. It came out in broken, ugly pieces. The Crimson Garter, Mal Granger, how he owned her, the whiskey bottle, the scar, the escape, the lie, the stolen ticket, the name, Anna Schmidt. She told him everything, the whole sordid, shameful story. She ended, weeping. "I am a liar. I am a whore. I am everything they said." She waited, huddled by the creek, for the disgust, for the anger, for him to tell her to get off his land. The silence stretched. She heard him take a single, slow breath. "You're right," he said, his voice flat. She flinched. "You are a liar. You stole a name. You ran. He walked around, crouching in front of her, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were not angry. They were something else. They were pained. You're not the only one who's run from something. Clara waited by the creek, her body hunched, hollowed out by the confession. She was an open wound, and she expected him to pour salt in it. She expected him to walk away, to tell her to pack, to finally treat her like the trash she had always believed herself to be. Levi did not walk away. He sat on the damp earth, his back against a cottonwood, looking not at her, but at the muddy water sliding by. The silence stretched, filled only by the creek's gurgle and her own shuddering breaths. My wife, Elspeth, he began, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. She was from back east, soft, like that Anna Schmidt you talked about, pious and gentle. This land terrified her. The wind, the silence, the emptiness, it ate at her. Clara lifted her head, her tears forgotten, confused by the sudden shift. She hated it here, Levi continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. And I resented her for it. I wanted a partner who could face this land with me, and I got a woman who cried when the wind blew. So I stopped coming home. Not all the time, but enough. I'd ride the range, stay out for days, or I'd ride into Willow Ridge. I'd drink. He picked up a pebble and threw it into the creek. Plunk. There was a small raid. Renegades. Not a war party, just desperate men. They hit the small ranches. They came here. They set fire to the barn. Elspeth. She panicked. She ran from the cabin, right into them. He stopped, his throat working. I was in town. I was in the back room of the saloon, playing cards and drinking. By the time I got back, the barn was ash. Thomas was hiding under the porch. And Elspeth. He swiped a hand across his face, a rough, angry gesture. She was dead, all for a few horses and a sack of flour. He turned his head and looked at her, his eyes a pit of self-loathing that she recognized instantly. It was the same look she saw in her own reflection. You ran from Granger, he said, his voice rough. I've been running from that saloon, from that bottle, from that fire. For 2 years, I buried her, and I buried myself right along with her. I've been a ghost in my own home. I've been hiding behind my grief, but it ain't grief. It's shame. He stood up, his tall frame blocking the last of the light. You ran to save your life. Clara, I ran because I was a coward who let his wife die alone. He held out his hand, not to comfort her, not to pull her up, just held it. She looked at his calloused, steady hand. She looked at his face, now stripped bare of its stoic mask. He was as broken as she was. He was a liar, too, in his own way. They were two halves of the same coin, both scarred, both running. She put her hand in his. He pulled her to her feet. They stood in the twilight, the chasm of their pasts now a shared space between them. So, he said, his voice returning to its familiar, flat tone. A man named Mal Granger is in town. He thinks he owns you. He has a poster. Paper, Levi said, the word a dismissal. Just paper. He's dangerous. Levi, you don't know him. He'll hurt you. He'll hurt Thomas. He can try. He led her back to the cabin. Thomas was asleep at the table, his head on his arms, having cried himself out. Levi gently lifted him and carried him to his bed. Clara stood in the middle of the room, her valise still open on her cot. She felt different. The terror was still there, a cold snake in her belly. But it was no longer alone. Levi's confession had wrapped around it, a strange, fierce warmth. He came back out. You're not running, he said. What are we going to do? Tomorrow, he said. We go to town. She slept fitfully, the knife back under her pillow. But for the first time, it wasn't her only comfort. The sound of Levi's steady breathing in the next room was a bulwark. The next morning, they rode the wagon into Willow Ridge. Clara sat on the buckboard, her back straight, Her hands folded in her lap. She had braided her hair tight, and she wore her patched brown dress. She would not hide. She felt Levi's presence beside her, solid as the bluff. He didn't stop at the mercantile. He stopped at the sheriff's office, right in front of the poster. "Levi, don't," she whispered. He ignored her. He swung down from the wagon, walked straight to the poster, and ripped it from the post. He tore the paper in half, then in quarters, and let the pieces fall into the dust. Mrs. Henderson, sweeping the boardwalk in front of the mercantile, gasped and froze. Levi turned and walked into the sheriff's office. Clara, her heart pounding, slid off the wagon and followed him. Sheriff Brody was at his desk, drinking coffee. He looked up, his eyes moving from Levi's grim face to Clara's pale one, then to the door, where he could see the scraps of paper in the street. "Mornin', Levi, Clara." He deliberately used her name. "Looks like you had some trouble with the local advertisements." "That man," Levi said, his voice flat. "Mal Granger. He's at the hotel." "I'm aware," Brody said. "Had a talk with him last night. He claims that woman." He nodded at Clara. "Is his property. Says she's a runaway. Indentured. He called it?" "She's not," Levi said. "She's my partner. She lives on my ranch. And if he or any man he's hired sets foot on my land, I will defend her." Brody took a slow sip of coffee. He looked at Clara. "That poster's been up since yesterday. He's waiting. He wants you to come to him. He's trying to spook you, girl, trying to make you run." "I'm not running," Clara said, her voice quiet but clear. The sheriff nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Good. Now, Levi, I appreciate you stating your intent, but you need to let the law handle this. Don't go looking for him." "I won't look for him," Levi said. "But he'll come looking for us, and I'll be ready." "Fair enough." Brody stood up. "I did some checking after you and I first spoke. Levi, that day in the store, you said she was running from something awful, so I sent a telegram to the marshal in Cheyenne, asked about a saloon called the Crimson Garter and a man named Mal Granger." Clara stared at him, stunned. "Turns out," Brody continued, "Mr. Granger ain't just a saloon owner. He's got a reputation. The marshal's been looking for a reason to pin something on him for years. Human trafficking, forged labor contracts. But he's slippery. The girls are always too scared to testify." Clara started. "You don't have to say a word," Brody said, holding up a hand. "I'm just telling you what I know. Granger is a snake, but he's a snake in my town now. You go on home. Both of you. Keep your doors locked, and keep that rifle handy, Levi. But don't use it unless he's on your land and makes a threat. You understand?" "I understand," Levi said. They walked out into the sunlight. The ripped poster was already scattering in the wind. Levi helped her onto the wagon, his hand firm on her elbow. The ride home was as silent as the ride in, but the silence was different. It was the quiet of a line drawn in the sand. They waited. The next day was a torture. Every gust of wind sounded like horses. Every distant hawk's cry sounded like a shout. They worked in the barn, close to the cabin. Levi's rifle oiled and loaded, leaning against the wall. Thomas, sensing the terrible, coiled tension, stayed inside, quiet as a mouse. The afternoon was hot and still. Clara was kneading bread, her hands working the dough with a frantic, repetitive energy. Levi was on the porch, sharpening an axe, his eyes on the road. Then they came. 3 riders, black shapes against the bright prairie. They didn't take the main road. They cut across the south pasture, heading straight for the cabin. "Clara," Levi said, his voice calm. "Get inside. Lock the door. Keep Thomas in your room, away from the windows." "Levi, no." "Do it, now!" She ran, her hands covered in flour. She grabbed Thomas, her heart a cold knot of dread. "Get in my room. Thomas, under the cot. And you don't come out. You don't make a sound. You hear me?" He nodded, his eyes wide with terror, and scrambled into the small room. Clara locked the heavy plank door. She ran to her room, but she didn't hide. She grabbed the skinning knife from under her pillow and went to the cabin's single window. Peeking through the edge of the calico curtain, she saw Levi. He hadn't moved from the porch. He was just sitting in his chair, the axe at his feet, the loaded rifle resting across his lap. The three riders pulled up, 10 yards from the porch. She recognized him instantly. Mal Granger. He was even bigger than she remembered, fleshy and imposing in a black duster, his face red from the sun. The two men with him were hired guns. She could tell. Hard, empty faces. "Well, well," Granger boomed, his voice the same gravelly roar that haunted her nightmares. "Clara Belle, I know you're in there. Found yourself a little dirt farmer, did you? Thought you could hide from me." Levi didn't move. He just sat, the rifle barrel pointed at Granger's chest. "You're on my land," Levi said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Granger laughed. "Your land? This is my business. I'm here for my property. Send her out, farmer, and I'll let you keep your miserable life." "She's not your property. She's not coming out. You've got till the count of 3 to turn your horses around. 1. Granger's smile vanished. His hand moved toward the pistol on his hip. "You think you can take all 3 of us, farmer?" "I only need to take 1, Levi said. "And I don't miss at this range. 2. The hired man on Granger's right shifted, his horse nervous. He looked at Levi, then at Granger, clearly weighing the odds. "She's a thief," Granger roared, his face purpling. "She owes me." 3. Levi raised the rifle to his shoulder, the click of the hammer being pulled back echoing in the silence. Clara's knife was clutched so tightly her hand was numb. She was poised to run out. To what? Distract them? "Granger, a 4th rider, coming fast from the road. Sheriff Brody, his horse lathered, a shotgun in his hand." Granger swore, his hand dropping from his pistol. Brody reined in, his horse flanking the 3 men, his shotgun aimed at Granger. "Malachi Granger," the sheriff's voice was loud and formal. "I have a warrant here from the U.S., Marshal in Cheyenne. You're under arrest." "Arrest? For what?" Granger blustered. "For collecting my own property. For human trafficking," Brody said. "For forgery, for fraud. Seems you've been selling girls on false labor contracts for near on 5 years." And the marshal finally found a judge who'll sign the paper. Granger looked from Brody's shotgun to Levi's rifle. He was trapped. This is a mistake. That scarred whore in there." "She's a liar." "Maybe," Brody said. "But you're going to tell it to a federal judge. Hands up, all 3 of you." Clara watched, her body trembling so hard she had to lean against the wall. The 2 hired men raised their hands instantly. They were paid to bully, not to fight a sheriff with a warrant. Granger, his face a mask of fury, slowly raised his hands. Brody disarmed them, one by one. He tied their hands. He looked at Levi. "Appreciate you. Holding 'em till I got here. Levi." Levi lowered his rifle. He didn't say a word. He just watched as Brody led the 3 men, now tied to their saddles, away from the ranch and toward town. Clara stared as they disappeared, a cloud of dust in their wake. He was gone. Mal Granger was gone. He was arrested. He was gone. The cabin door opened. Levi stood there, his face pale but calm. He put the rifle by the door. "It's done. Clara, he's gone." She stumbled out of her room, the knife falling from her nerveless fingers and clattering to the floor. She looked at him. He was safe. Thomas was safe. She was safe. She had been carrying the terror for so long. It had become a part of her, a second skeleton. And now, it was gone. The space it left behind was a hollow, aching void. She took 1 step toward him, and then she broke. It was not the silent weeping he had seen before. It was a complete unraveling. A raw, guttural sob tore from her throat, and her legs gave out. He caught her. He didn't just hold her. He absorbed the full weight of her collapse, sinking to the floor with her, pulling her tight against his chest. She buried her face in his shirt and wept. She wept for the years at the Crimson Garter. She wept for the girl she had been. She wept for the scar, for the shame, for the running. I thought I had to carry it alone," she choked out, her words broken by sobs. I didn't know someone would ever fight for me. Shh, he said, his hand stroking her hair. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to carry it anymore. The terror had been scoured out, and in the following weeks, something new began to grow. The tension in the cabin was replaced by a quiet intimacy. They fell into a new rhythm. They woke together, in Levi's bed, before dawn. They would lie for a few minutes in the pre-dawn cool, tangled under the furs, his hand stroking her scar, not with pity, but with a familiar, possessive tenderness. He treated her body like it was holy, like it was something to be revered, not used. And in his touch, she began to see it that way, too. They shared slow mornings, drinking coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise. They talked. They truly talked. She told him stories of the saloon, no longer as confessions, but as memories. He told her about Elspeth, not with guilt, but with a quiet, sad fondness. Laughter, a rare commodity before, became common. It was usually over small things. Levi, clumsy with a needle, trying to mend his own shirt. Clara, covered in flour after Thomas sneezed. They were small, simple moments of joy that felt profound. Clara, in turn, began to build a life. The cabin, once just a refuge, became a home. She put up new curtains, made from the blue calico Levi had bought. She started a small garden, fencing it off from the rabbits, her hands gentle in the soil. Her greatest project was Thomas, the boy. Now that the shadow of Granger was gone and the tension between his father and Clara had eased, blossomed. He was no longer the solemn, wary child. He was a 7-year-old boy. He followed Clara everywhere, chattering, asking questions. Ma'am, Clara, he said one afternoon, holding his worn primer. Pa don't have time. Can you teach me the words? So they began. Every afternoon, after the main chores were done, they would sit at the table, their heads bent together. She taught him his letters, the sounds they made. She was patient, her voice low and steady. He was a bright boy, and he soaked it up. One evening, weeks later, he was reading aloud from a passage, his finger tracing the words. And the horse ran to the ma. He stumbled. Man, Clara provided gently. Man, Thomas repeated. He looked up at her, his face beaming with pride. I read it. Ma, I read the whole. He froze. The word hung in the air. Ma, Clara's breath caught. Thomas's face flushed, and he looked at Levi, terrified, as if he had cursed. Levi, sitting by the fire oiling a bridle, didn't look up, but a small, almost invisible smile touched his mouth. Clara looked at Thomas. Her eyes, they were stinging. A terrible, wonderful ache was in her throat. She tried to speak, but she couldn't. She just nodded at the boy, her vision blurring, and put her hand over his. He smiled, relieved, and went back to the book. Clara turned her head away, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand, weeping quietly, not for sadness, but for a joy so fierce it felt like pain. The next day, Levi returned from a trip to Willow Ridge. He had been gone all day, and when he returned, he was carrying a folded, official-looking document. He was nervous. She had never seen him nervous. He found her in the garden, weeding. He stood there for a moment, just watching her. Clara, he said. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron. Is something wrong? Did you hear news? No news. He held out the paper. I was at the courthouse. She took it, her hands trembling slightly. She unfolded it. It was a deed to the Cutter Ranch. But it wasn't just his name on it. He had had it redrawn. Levi Cutter and Clara Cutter. She stared at the name. Clara Cutter. I don't have a ring, he said, his voice rough. He gestured to the land around them. I don't have much, just this land. It's hard, and it takes everything. But it's ours. She looked at him, overwhelmed, her heart pounding. I don't want to help her. Clara, he said, finally meeting her eyes. "I've had a helper. I want a partner. This land, it's yours if you want it. Half of it. All of it. I want you to be my wife. My partner." She looked down at the deed, at the name he had given her. Clara Cutter. It looked right. It looked like the truth. She stepped forward and put her arms around his neck, pressing her face into his chest. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." He held her, his arms like steel bands, and for the first time, Clara Bell felt like she was truly, finally, home. A week later, she was in the mercantile, buying sugar and coffee for she smiled at the thought, their wedding supper. They were going to have the judge say the words next week, Mrs. Brody nodded at her as she came in. Mr. Henderson was polite. The whispers had stopped. She was no longer the runaway. She was Levi Cutter's partner. She was waiting for her goods when she saw the stack of newspapers on the counter. The Cheyenne Daily Leader, a week old. The headline was about a cattle dispute, but a smaller item. On the side, caught her eye. A local brief. Saloon owner released. Her blood went cold. She stepped closer, her hand outstretched. Malachi Granger, arrested by Willow Ridge authorities on a federal warrant for trafficking, was released on bail yesterday in Cheyenne. A court clerk cited a procedural error. In the warrant, Granger has been released pending a new hearing, date to be determined. He was last seen leaving the courthouse in the company of 2 unidentified men. He was out. The bag of sugar in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. He was out, and he knew where she was. The newspaper felt brittle in her hand, a dry, dead thing. Released on bail. Clara folded the paper, her movements slow and deliberate. She paid Mr. Henderson for her sugar and yeast, her face a calm, blank mask. She walked out of the mercantile, the bell tinkling softly behind her, and climbed onto the wagon. She did not look at the post where the poster had been. She looked at the sky. It was a pale, brassy color, bleached by a sun that had forgotten how to be gentle. Summer had arrived like a judgment. The brief, hopeful green of spring had vanished, baked brown by a relentless drought that settled over the territory. The wind, which had been cold and sharp, was now a hot, dry breath that smelled of alkali dust and withering sage. The news of Granger's release settled over the ranch, an invisible, choking layer, compounding the tension of the drought. The wedding was postponed, not by words, but by a shared, silent understanding. There was a shadow on the land, and it was not cast by a cloud. The land was dying. The creek, where Levi had confessed his shame, had slowed to a muddy trickle. The grass in the pastures was gone, leaving cracked earth. The cattle grew thin, their ribs sharp under their hides, their bawling low and constant. Water was scarce, their well was low, and the lake where they had fished was a shrinking, saline puddle. Levi was grim. He and Clara worked from before sunrise until long after dark, riding the range, trying to find patches of grazing, hauling water. The partnership he had wanted was forged in this shared hardship. They moved as one, their conversations short, practical, their shared anxiety a third presence between them. The intimacy they had found was still there, but it was banked, like an ember, waiting for rain, waiting for Granger. One afternoon, Levi rode back to the cabin, his face gray with exhaustion. "The wire is down on the North Range, near the bluffs. Cattle are drifting. If they get into that box canyon, they'll die." "We'll go," Clara said, already pulling on her gloves. "No, I'll go. You stay with Thomas. It's too hot. And I want you near the cabin, near the rifle." "He won't come in this heat," she argued. "He'll wait. You can't mend that much wire alone." He looked at her, at the stubborn set of her jaw. He nodded. "Once. Bring 3 canteens." The North Range was a desolate, sun-blasted expanse of rock and dust. It was past noon, the heat well over 100 degrees. The air shimmered. They found the broken fence, A cottonwood, dead from the drought, had fallen, snapping 3 strands of wire. They worked in a grim, exhausting silence. The wire was hot to the touch. Levi stretched it, his muscles cording, while Clara, her small, strong hands deft, worked the pliers, splicing and tying. The sun beat on her back, her clothes soaked with sweat, the salt stinging her eyes. Levi was wrestling with the last post, trying to set it deep in the baked, rocky soil. He put his shoulder to it, his boot braced on a rock. "It's not moving." There was a sharp, dry crack. It was not the post. It was the rock under his boot. It shifted, slid, and Levi went down, his full weight twisting. A sound tore from his throat, a sharp, guttural cry of pain that was cut off instantly. Clara dropped the pliers. He was on the ground, his face white, his teeth gritted. His left leg was trapped beneath him at an unnatural angle. "Levi, the leg!" he ground out. "It's broke. I felt it snap." She knelt beside him, her mind racing. The panic a cold spike in the heat. The bone had pushed through the fabric of his denims, a sharp, white shard. Blood was already darkening the cloth. "Don't move. Don't move." She looked around. They were 10, maybe 12, miles from the cabin. Farther to town. Thomas was alone. Levi was bleeding. And the sun was a hammer. "Clara!" His voice was tight with pain. "Listen to me. Take my horse. He's faster. Ride back to the cabin. Get Thomas. Lock yourselves in. I'm not leaving you here. You have to. I can't be moved. Granger, if he finds you, you have to get the boy to safety." She stared at him, at the man who had fought for her. He was thinking of her safety, even now. "No," she said, her voice flat. "I'm not leaving you to die. I'm not leaving Thomas alone. I'm getting help. Clara, you can't ride to town. Not in this. It's 30 miles. "I can," she said. She ripped a long strip from her petticoat. She poured precious water from a canteen onto it, cleaning the worst of the grit from the wound. She sacrificed the second canteen, splinting his leg with 2 broken fence posts and securing them with the wet cloth and scraps of wire. He passed out twice while she did it. When she was done, she stood. "I'll leave a canteen. Clara, don't take the water. I'll be faster if I'm not worried about you." She lied. She kissed his forehead, his skin burning. "I'll be back. I swear to you. Levi, I'll be back." She took his horse, a big roan built for endurance. She transferred the saddle. She took one last look at him, a small, broken shape in the vast, hostile land. And she rode. She did not spare the horse. She did not spare herself. The ride was a blur of shimmering heat, choking dust and pounding hooves. The sun was an enemy, driving needles into her eyes. Her throat swelled shut. The world shrank to the roan's pumping shoulders and the endless brown horizon. She didn't ride from something. She rode for something. She rode for the man in the dust. She rode for the boy in the cabin. She rode for the name Cutter. She passed the ranch, not even slowing, screaming for Thomas to lock the door as she thundered past. She saw his small, terrified face in the window. The last 5 miles into Willow Ridge were a dream of pain. The roan was stumbling, its sides heaving. Clara was swaying in the saddle, lightheaded, her vision blurring at the edges. She held on by pure will. She hit the main street, the horse's hooves cannon shots in the sleepy afternoon. She pulled up at the sheriff's office, sliding, not climbing, from the saddle. She burst through the door. Brody was asleep, his chair tilted back. "Levi," she gasped, her voice a dry croak. "The North Range. He's hurt. His leg. It's broken. Bad." Brody was on his feet instantly. "Where?" she told him, the words tumbling out. "I need a wagon and water." "I'll get the wagon," Brody said, grabbing his hat. You look like death. Girl, go to the hotel. Get water." "No," she said, leaning against the doorframe, the world tilting. "I'm going with you." She staggered to the town pump, drank until she was sick, then drank again. By the time Brody returned with the supply wagon, she was back on her feet. her face pale, but her eyes burning. She fainted an hour later, somewhere on the prairie, the wagon jolting over the ruts. She just slipped sideways off the buckboard. Brody caught her, cursed, and laid her in the wagon bed. She woke when she heard Levi's low groan as they loaded him. She had succeeded. Levi was laid up for a week. The leg was bad, the town doctor setting it as best he could. He was confined to his bed, a feverish, frustrated captive in his own home. Clara ran the ranch. She cared for Levi, cooked for Thomas, and hauled water for the cattle. Her body one long, searing ache. The tension returned, threefold. They were vulnerable. Levi, their protector, was wounded. That was when Granger returned. He did not come with thugs. He did not come with guns drawn. He came in a smart, black buggy, wearing a suit, and he came with Sheriff Brody. Clara was outside, hanging laundry. When they pulled up, her blood ran cold. "Clara," Brody said, climbing down. He looked miserable. "Mr. Granger has papers." Levi heard the voices. He limped to the door, his face dark with pain and anger, using a carved piece of cottonwood as a crutch. "What is this, Brody?" Levi demanded. Granger stepped out of the buggy, a smug smile on his fleshy face. He held a sheaf of papers. "This, farmer, is the law, something you seem to have forgotten." He handed the papers to Brody, who handed them to Levi. It's an indenture contract," Granger said, his voice dripping with false civility. "Signed by Clara Bell, pledging her services to me for a term of 5 years, in exchange for considerable debts, which she then broke, stealing money and fleeing my employ. It's all legal. Signed, notarized, filed with the court in Cheyenne." Clara stared at the paper in Levi's hand. She saw her name. She saw a signature. It was not her signature, but it was a passable forgery. "This is a lie," she said, her voice shaking. "Is it?" Granger purred. "Tell that to the judge. Sheriff Brody here was kind enough to inform me that you, Clara, are in his jurisdiction. I'm here to reclaim my property." "She is not property," Levi roared, taking a step forward, his crutch sinking into the dust. Brody put a hand on Levi's chest. "Levi, calm down. This looks legal. I can't ignore it. It's a civil matter." "So you're just going to let him take her?" "No," Brody said, his face grim. "He's not taking anyone. Not today. He has filed a petition with Judge Miller. A hearing is set day after tomorrow, 10 o'clock. The judge will hear his claim, and he'll hear your side." "A hearing?" Clara whispered. "A public hearing." "Be there," Granger said, his smile widening. He looked at Clara, his eyes traveling over her, lingering. "Or I'll have the warrant served, and I'll take you back to the Garter and Chains. Farmer's choice." He climbed back into his buggy and drove away, leaving them in a cloud of dust and silence. That night, the cabin was a tomb. Levi sat at the table, his leg propped on a chair, the forged contract spread out before him. Clara moved like a ghost, her face pale. "We need a lawyer," Levi said, his voice flat. "We can't afford a lawyer. We can't afford not to." The next morning, Levi, his face etched with pain, hauled himself onto the wagon. They rode to town and found the office of Mr. Davies, the only lawyer in Willow Ridge. He was an old man with spectacles and a waistcoat stained with tobacco. They sat in his dusty office, the air thick with the smell of old paper. Clara, her voice low and trembling, told him everything. The Crimson Garter, the escape, the stolen name, Anna Schmidt, the forged signature, Mr. Davies listened, his fingers steepled. He examined the contract. "He's clever," Davies said, his voice dry as paper. "This is a forgery, and a good one, but it's dated. He claims you signed this in Cheyenne, on May 14th. Clara looked at him, confused. "According to Sheriff Brody's records?" Davies continued, a small, dry smile touching his lips. "You arrived in Willow Ridge on May 5th. You were here, branding calves with Mr. Cutter, On the day Granger claims you were in Cheyenne signing this. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced Clara's dread.
So, it's a lie. We can prove it.
Yes, Davies said. But there is a problem. In order to prove this is a forgery, you will have to testify. Under oath. You will have to tell the court why you were here. You will have to admit to coming here under a false name. You will have to tell them about the Crimson Garter. You will, in essence, have to confess to everything you've run from, in front of the entire town. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Levi. She thought of Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Brody, the whispers, runaway whore. She would have to stand up and admit it was all true. They sat on the wagon, outside the lawyer's office, the ride home forgotten. Clara was staring at her hands.
I can't, she whispered. I can't. I'll be the town spectacle. They'll hate me. They'll run us out. It will shame you. It will shame Thomas.
Levi was silent for a long time. The street was quiet. He reached over, his hand rough, and touched her face. He didn't cup her jaw. He laid his fingers gently, reverently, against the scar. She met his gaze. His eyes were steady. You've been shamed enough, he said, his voice low and gentle. You've been shamed for his crimes. You've been shamed for surviving. You don't owe anyone shame anymore. Clara, not him, not this town, not me. You just owe them the truth. Let them choke on it. The day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. It was not a real courtroom, just the largest room in the town hall, but every bench was full. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Brody were in the front row, their faces alight with grim curiosity. Every rancher, every shopkeeper, every gossip was there. Clara walked in, her head high. Levi was beside her, his crutch thumping on the wooden floor. He looked neither left nor right. He helped her to the bench, then sat beside her, his bad leg stretched out, his presence a solid, unmovable wall. Thomas sat on his other side, his small hand clutching Levi's. Granger was there, at the front, with a slick-looking lawyer from Cheyenne. He looked confident, smiling at the judge. The hearing began. Judge Miller, a stern circuit judge with a gray beard, called for order. Granger's lawyer presented the contract, making a grand speech about the sanctity of contracts, the perfidy of a thieving woman, and his client's simple desire for justice. Then, Mr. Davies called her. I call Clara Bell. A murmur went through the crowd. Bell, not Cutter. Clara stood. She felt the dozens of eyes on her, stripping her bare. She was trembling. She walked to the front and took the oath. Please state your name for the court. Davies said, My name is Clara Bell. And did you sign this contract? No, sir, I did not. Can you tell the court where you were on May 14th of this year? I was here, Clara said, her voice gaining a bit of strength. I was at the Cutter Ranch. I was branding calves. Granger's lawyer leaped up. Objection! She's lying. She has no proof. Mr. Cutter can testify to that, Davies said calmly. And so can his hired hand, Silas. But that is not the only reason this contract is a fraud. Miss Bell, I want you to tell the judge. I want you to tell everyone why Malachi Granger has forged this document. Tell them what you ran from. This was it. Clara gripped the rail. She looked at Levi. He nodded. Once. She turned to the judge. I worked for Mr. Granger in his saloon in Cheyenne, the Crimson Garter. A wave of shocked whispers. Mrs. Henderson covered her mouth. I was not a singer, Clara said, her voice raw. She would not hide. He tried to sell me, to men. When I refused, when I fought back, he did this. She pointed to her scar. The courtroom fell silent. I ran. I had no money, no name. I came here on a ticket that was not mine. I came here as Anna Schmidt. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the shocked, hungry, pitying, disgusted faces. I lied. I lied because I was afraid. I lied to survive. But I did not steal, And I did not sign that paper." She stood there, trembling, but strong. She had said it. The truth. All of it. Judge Miller stared at her for a long, hard moment. He looked at Granger, whose smug smile was gone, replaced by a sneer. He looked at the contract. "Mr. Granger," the judge said, his voice cold, "this court finds your claim without merit. The contract is clearly a forgery. Your petition is dismissed." He banged his gavel. "Furthermore, I am referring this matter, and this fraudulent document, back to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne. I suspect your bail is about to be revoked. Get out of my courtroom." Granger's face went purple. He stormed out, his lawyer scrambling after him. The courtroom was utterly, profoundly silent. The townspeople just stared, their judgment suspended, replaced by a stunned awe. Clara's legs gave out. She slumped against the rail. And then, the sound of Levi's crutch. Thump, thump, thump. He walked past the benches, past the whispers, right up to the front. He stood in front of her, in front of the judge, in front of the entire town. He didn't say a word. He just put his hand on her cheek, turned her face to his, and kissed her. It was not a passionate kiss. It was a kiss of sealing, a kiss of fact, a public declaration, louder than any shout. "This is my wife. This is Clara Cutter." They walked out together, Levi leaning on her, his arm around her waist. The crowd parted for them like water. Sheriff Brody tipped his hat. "Mrs. Brody," her face pale, actually nodded. "Mrs." Henderson just stared, her mouth open. Clara walked through the street, her chin high. She was not ashamed. She was free. When they got back to the ranch, the air felt different. The heat was still there. The drought still oppressed the land, but the shadow was gone. Levi settled onto the porch, his leg propped up, his eyes closed. Clara went to the garden, to the small patch of earth she had tilled and watered with their precious well water. Ma, look." Thomas came running from behind the cabin, his face alight. He ran to her, grabbing her hand. "Look." He pulled her to her small, dusty garden. There, in the cracked gray earth, a single flower had bloomed. It was a prairie primrose, its petals a defiant, fragile pink against the dust. It had survived the wind, the heat, the drought. It had survived. Clara knelt, her hand trembling as she reached out. She touched the soft petals. It was real. Levi was there, standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes shining, a slow smile spreading across her face. "It's starting, isn't it?" she whispered. The rain came in late August. It was not a gentle spring shower, but a deluge, a biblical flood that hammered the hard-baked earth for 3 days and 3 nights. The dry creek bed roared to life, a muddy, churning river that tore at the bluffs. The dead, brown land drank, and drank, and drank. When the storm broke, the world was washed clean. The sky was a sharp, high blue, and the air smelled of wet earth and sage. The drought was broken. Months passed. Autumn arrived, painting the cottonwoods along the creek in strokes of brilliant yellow. The land, so starved, had responded to the rain with a desperate, beautiful bounty. The grasses returned, thick and high. The cattle, thin and ghostly, grew fat and sleek. The ranch, which had been balanced on the knife edge of ruin, was thriving. The family found its rhythm. It was a rhythm built of shared labor and quiet comfort. It was the sound of the coffee grinder in the pre-dawn dark. It was the easy, unspoken partnership of Clara and Levi mending tack, their hands working in tandem. It was the sound of Thomas, his voice growing confident, reading aloud by the fire while Clara baked bread. The cabin warm and smelling of yeast and wood smoke. Clara had changed. The harsh, hunted look in her eyes had softened. The thinness in her face had been replaced by the quiet strength of a woman who was fed, who was safe, who was loved. Her scar was still there. It was a silvered mark, a pale crescent that pulled at the corner of her eye, but it no longer defined her. It was simply a part of her, like the color of her hair or the calluses on her hands. She saw the change not in her own reflection, but in the town. She rode to Willow Ridge for supplies. Thomas beside her on the wagon. She walked into the mercantile, the bell tinkling. Mrs. Henderson was at the counter, sorting ribbon. She looked up, her expression strained for a moment, the memory of the courtroom hanging in the air. Then she nodded. It was not a grand gesture. It was a small, tight dip of her chin. "Afternoon, Mrs. Cutter," she said. The name, Mrs. Cutter, spoken aloud in this place of her deepest shame, landed with a quiet finality. "Mrs. Henderson," Clara replied, her voice steady. She gave the woman a small, genuine smile. "Mrs." Brody came in. She, too, nodded. The town had heard the truth. They had heard what she endured, and they had seen Levi Cutter kiss her in front of them all. Some, like Amos Fitch, still held to their cold judgment, but most were quiet. They did not stare. They did not whisper. They nodded. They had, in their own grudging frontier way, accepted her. She was no longer the runaway whore. She was Levi's wife. The biggest change was the barn. The old one, the one that held the ghosts of Elspeth and the fire, had been torn down. In its place, they built a new one. It was a symbol, and they all knew it. It was not Levi's barn, it was their barn. Levi's leg had healed, leaving him with a slight, permanent limp that only showed when he was tired. But he was strong. He set the heavy foundation stones, his muscles straining. Clara worked beside him. She was not the helper. She was the partner. She learned to use the saw, her arm moving in a steady, sure rhythm. She hauled lumber. She climbed the rafters, her skirts tied up, hammering shingles into place, her movements as confident as any man's. They worked together, the sound of their hammer blows echoing in the valley. They spoke openly, their words easy. "We'll need to lay in more feed than last year," Levi said. "Measuring a beam, the herd's bigger, and the winter, the hard rains mean a hard snow." "I'll trade the last of the garden vegetables for salt," Clara said, not pausing in her work. "And I'll patch the old tarps for the woodpile. We'll be ready." He stopped, just watching her. He saw the strength in her back, the smear of sawdust on her cheek. He saw his partner. "It's a good barn," he said, his voice quiet. "It's our barn," she replied. And in her voice, he heard the pride of ownership, something she had never known. In late September, the post rider, a young man who now tipped his hat to Clara, brought a letter. It was old, the envelope battered and gray, stained with water and mud. It had been forwarded from Cheyenne, then lost, then found. The return address was a small town in Nebraska. The name on the front was Miss Anna Schmidt, care of Levi Cutter. Clara's hands went cold. She stood on the porch, the letter trembling. It felt like a ghost. Levi, seeing her face, limped over, his hand resting on her shoulder. "What is it?" It's from her," Clara whispered. "The real one. Open it." She slit the envelope with her kitchen knife. The paper inside was fine, the handwriting neat and looped. She read it aloud, her voice soft. "Dear Miss Schmidt, I write this in haste. I am not sure if you ever arrived in Wyoming. My letters to Mr. Cutter went unanswered. I must confess, I did not go. My prayers were answered here, in my own town. I have married. My husband, Mr. Gideon Black, is a blacksmith, a good and pious man. I hope Mr. Cutter was not terribly inconvenienced by my failure to appear. I pray you found a good situation, wherever you are. God be with you. Sincerely, Mrs. Anna Black." Clara read the letter twice. She looked up at Levi. The last thread, the last piece of the lie, was severed. Anna Schmidt had never been coming. She had been free all along. A slow smile touched Levi's mouth. "A blacksmith, eh? Well, she sounds happy." "She is," Clara said. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. That night, she sat at the table while Levi and Thomas slept. She took out her own pen and paper. "Dear Mrs. Black," she wrote. "Your letter, intended for another, found me instead. My name is Clara. I was not the bride Mr. Cutter ordered. I was a woman running for her life. I took your ticket from the agent in Cheyenne, a theft I confessed to my husband long ago. I am not pious. I am not the woman you are, but Mr. Cutter, the man you left behind, is the finest man I have ever known. He is my husband now. We have a son. Thomas, your failure to appear was not an inconvenience. It was, I believe, my salvation. I cannot thank you enough. I wish you joy with your blacksmith. Sincerely, Mrs. Clara Cutter. She sealed the letter. She felt the last of the shame, the last of the crimson garter, fall away. A week later, the air had the sharp, cold bite of true autumn. Levi, his eyes holding a quiet secret, stopped her after the morning chores. "Put on your warm cloak," he said. "We're riding out. The fences can wait." He took her not to the range, but to the lake. The small alkali basin was full again, the water a deep, cold blue, reflecting the sky. The aspens on the far side were a shock of gold. He led her to the bank, to the exact spot where she had caught the perch, where they had shared their first laugh. A bench was there. It was simple, made of the same cottonwood as their barn, sanded smooth, built low to the ground. It was strong. It was permanent. Clara stopped, her hand going to her mouth. She touched the wood. It was his handiwork. She could tell. I thought you might want a quiet place of your own," Levi said, his voice rough. "A place to just be, where no one's asking anything of you." She had never had a place of her own. Not a room, not a chair, not even her own name. She looked at the bench, a simple, sturdy thing, and saw a throne. She turned to him. There were no words. She put her arms around his neck and pulled his face down to hers. She kissed him. It was not the desperate, uncertain kiss of their first time. It was not the healing, reverent touch they shared in the dark. It was a kiss of absolute knowledge. It was a kiss of equals, of partners, of a man and a woman who had seen the worst of each other and chosen to stay. It was confident, and it was free. They rode home slowly, the sun warm on their backs. That night, their love-making was a reflection of that kiss. It was slow and sure and deep. There were no ghosts in the room. There was no fear, no shame, just the comfort of his hands, which knew every line of her body, and the solid, reassuring weight of his heart beating against hers. There was nothing left unsaid. The last threat came not with a gun, but with a word. They were in town, all three of them, loading the wagon for winter. The townspeople were polite. The silence was respectful. But one man, Amos Fitch, the rancher whose land bordered theirs to the south, blocked their path. He was a gaunt, sour man, his face pinched with a self-righteous fury. "Cutter," he said, spitting tobacco near Levi's boot. Levi went still. "Amos, I've held my tongue, but my wife says she won't come to town socials. She won't bring our daughters. Not while that woman," he jerked his chin at Clara, "is allowed to walk here, free as you please, after what she confessed, in open court." Thomas flinched, grabbing Clara's hand. "She's corrupting the morals of this town. Levi," Fitch declared, his voice rising. "It ain't right. It ain't decent. A confessed whore, parading as a wife. You should have sent her packing." Levi's face went dark. He stepped in front of Clara, his body a rigid shield. His limp was pronounced as he shifted his weight, his hand clenching into a fist. "Amos," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You've got 10 seconds to get your shadow off my wife. You're talking about things you don't understand." "I understand sin," Fitch shot back. "And she is covered in it." "Levi," Clara's voice. It was calm. She put her hand on Levi's arm. A gentle pressure. He stopped, surprised, and looked at her. She stepped out from behind him. She was not the woman who had hidden in the wagon. She was not the woman who had trembled in the courtroom. She faced Amos Fitch. Her gaze was level. Her face, scar and all, was calm. "Mr. Fitch," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the street. "You are right. I am not a pious woman. I am not Mrs. Henderson. I have done things to survive that you cannot imagine." Fitch looked taken aback by her directness. "Then you admit—" "I admit," she interrupted. That I am alive. I admit that I fought for my life, and I won. My presence does not corrupt you, Mr. Fitch. It just offends you. But my survival is not about you. My past is not a weapon for you to use, and my marriage is not for you to judge. She took a step, standing squarely in the dusty street, her head high. She put her arm through Levi's, claiming him, just as he had claimed her. If my presence offends you, don't look my way. This land, she said, gesturing to the whole vast, hard territory around them, doesn't care about your morals. It cares about work. It cares about survival. And this land is mine, too. Now, please, step aside. We have to get home. Fitch was speechless. He stared, his mouth open, at this woman who had not cowered, who had not wept, but who had simply stated her truth as fact. He looked at Levi, who was gazing at his wife with an expression of such profound, quiet pride that Fitch finally understood. He was beaten. He stepped aside. The wagon ride home was quiet. Thomas, sitting between them, took Clara's hand. You were like a queen, Ma," he whispered. Clara squeezed his hand, her heart aching. Winter came. It came as Levi had predicted, hard and deep. The first snow began to fall one evening in late November. Not a blizzard, but a soft, steady, silent blanketing of the world. The new barn was full. The woodpile was high. The cabin was banked with sod. They were ready. The three of them stood on the porch, watching the flakes drift down in the purple twilight. The light from the cabin window glowed behind them, a square of warm, yellow firelight. It was a beacon in the falling dark. Clara shivered, pulling her shawl tight. Levi, standing beside her, slipped out of his heavy wool coat. He wrapped it around her, pulling her back against his chest. She was enveloped in his warmth, in the familiar, safe smell of leather and wood smoke. He wrapped his arms around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. Thomas leaned against his father's good leg, content. They watched the snow make the world clean and new. "It's quiet," Clara murmured. "Aye." She leaned her head back against his shoulder. She touched her scar, her fingers tracing the old, familiar line. "It was just skin. Still think I'm not what you ordered?" she whispered. She felt him grin, the movement pressing against her hair. He tightened his grip, pulling her closer, his coat a shared shelter. "You're all I ever needed. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope it brought a piece of the Old West into your day. I would be honored if you would comment below and let me know what part of the world you are listening from. Please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories just like this one. And finally, I would truly appreciate it if you would share your thoughts on Clara and Levi's journey, in English, in the comments. Your words mean a great deal.